Looking for something to read? Well, these are the books that I've written. Hop on down to the description to find the Amazon links for all 4 of them, and keep your eyes open for more in the future. With that said, on to the video. Hello ladies and gentlemen, I'm the Omniviewer, and this marathon has finally reached a crucial moment. As a quick recap, just to make sure nobody's lost, I've taken up the challenge of comparing the first Godzilla film to the hard reboot that so many fans have called its spiritual successor. For the sake of clarity, I'm referring to the 1954 film as Gojira, the 2016 film as Shin, and the monster in either context as Godzilla. Part 1 was about comparing the human characters of each film, and Part 2 was devoted to Godzilla himself. If you've been keeping score at home, Shin lost both rounds, having fallen short in both categories when measured against the film it's supposedly equal or superior to. However, I recognize that when most people say the 2 films are equal, they're speaking about them in terms of thematics. They speak of how Shin is the first film in the series since Gojira to address socio-political subjects from a distinctly Japanese perspective. This statement is true as long as you ignore Godzilla Raids Again, King Kong vs. Godzilla, Mothra vs. Godzilla, All Monsters Attack, Godzilla vs. Hedorah, The Return of Godzilla, Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, and GMK, which I guess actually proves the statement blatantly false. But hey, why split hairs? Let's get back to Gojira and Shin. Even if they varied in quality up to this point, surely they must be equal in this capacity. Or maybe the evidence will tell us otherwise.
You're done pretending, aren't you?
Why keep dancing around it? I think people know how I feel about these movies at this point. Just for the heck of it, though, I'll start things off by throwing the Shin guards a bone. Unlike certain other recent entries in the series, Shin is not a film which haphazardly repeats something it thought sounded smart in hopes that it will sound smart too. It doesn't steal ideologies and rhetoric from other sources and instead formulates its own. Even I can acknowledge that. So in that regard, I'll give Shin some credit. If nothing else, this movie has original opinions. If you're a fan of Shin Godzilla, I recommend savoring that small victory, because from here on out, it's business as usual. You know, it occurs to me that the title might be a little bit misleading. There's no denying that both Gojira and Shin are thematically heavy films, but the nature of those themes are not directly comparable. In a broad sense, they both deal with the dangers of nuclear energy and the failure of Japanese bureaucracy, but the circumstances are where they diverge. For example, Gojira was made in response to external circumstances, nuclear tests by other nations in Japanese fishing waters, while Shin was made in response to internal circumstances, the Japanese government's poor response time to multiple disasters. Those are 2 very different scenarios from 2 very different eras, making them incomparable in the direct sense. Besides, comparing them directly runs the risk of debating which one has a better message or which political ideology is correct. Personally, I have no interest in turning this into a political debate, so I'll be avoiding that angle to the best of my ability.
So, what's the alternative?
Well, I'd say anyone who's been paying attention should be able to guess. My focus up to this point has always been about presentation, so that's where I'll set my sights on. As I've said in other videos, I am not necessarily opposed to political messages in fiction, though I do have some conditions. First, it has to be a natural part of the story and not be shoehorned in. Second, it has to make sense when scrutinized, without relying on double standards, straw men, factual errors, condescension, or other forms of cheap manipulation. Third and finally, it should not interfere with the story, or to put it another way, the story should be able to function without the political message, because that message isn't guaranteed to be relevant in 10 years, or even 1 year. On that first point, both films are able to pass, since they were both crafted with the idea of conveying political messages in mind. You could even argue that they're both subgenres of the political thriller, so that condition is met. The second condition isn't so clear-cut. Gojira passes, but I still believe that Shin's prime minister qualifies as a straw man. Still, I recognize that a lot of the political red tape being showcased here is genuine, or at least close enough given the fantastical plot. I also recognize that while the events of the film strike me as dishonest, the real events which inspired it have gone down in history as a textbook example of government incompetence. Ergo, I'll allow Shin to skirt by on this one with some caveats.
That leaves us with the final condition, that the story should be able to function without the politics. And it is here that we will be settling for the remainder of the video.
When we look at Gojira, the socio-political aspect of the film would have been crystal clear to Japanese audiences of the time, and it becomes clear to modern audiences who do their research. The opening scene depicts a fishing vessel getting caught in a lethal nuclear blast.
This is in direct reference to the tragedy of the Lucky Dragon 5, which occurred earlier in 1954.
The boat was near an American nuclear test site, but it was outside of the estimated danger zone, which they had prior knowledge of and were careful to avoid. Unfortunately, the test proved to be more powerful than predicted, rendering that limit to the danger zone pointless. Now, the Lucky Dragon 5 was not destroyed like the boat in Gojira, but it was caught in the fallout, which resulted in severe radiation poisoning among the cargo and the crew. It was considered a devastating maritime disaster in Japan, and this was on top of how the war ended with the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
So the beginning of the movie is an allegorical combination of events. We get two explosions like the ones that ended the war, but they occur to boats like the Lucky Dragon 5.
Midway through the film, after the expedition to Odo Island confirms Godzilla's existence, a presentation is given before the still new Senate. After Dr. Yamane shares his findings, things instantly devolve into a shouting match between party members on how to handle the situation.
I mentioned way back in the first video that the disappointment on Yamane's face expresses his own personal defeat, but it also expresses disappointment in the system itself.
Indeed, many Japanese citizens were dissatisfied with the new post-war system, partly thanks to unfamiliarity and partly because it was proving to be inefficient compared to what they had before. To make matters worse, the government in the film ultimately reaches the wrong conclusion, finding an excuse to attack Godzilla that ultimately brings him to the mainland, thus escalating the problem as opposed to resolving it.
Then we get the crucial moment in which Serizawa is confronted about using the oxygen destroyer against Godzilla.
He resists, understandably, and not without reason. Now, we never actually learn the full extent of Serizawa's backstory, but we get plenty of hints. Between his iPad, we can infer that Serizawa has not only witnessed horrors, he's had a front row seat to them. Ergo, it's only natural that he, as someone who knows what science hath wrought, would object to using the weapon he never intended to make for any reason. He sees it as a black and white matter, but the prospect of using his terrible weapon against Godzilla generates a large gray patch that challenges his resolve. Then we get the prayer for peace on TV.
Now, I admit there's a little bit of a contrivance in this scene. Prior to this moment, there's no evidence that the TV is on, but then suddenly it is on at a nice high volume so Serizawa can hear the mournful song and see the images of destruction. However, I believe the emotion of this scene is so powerful that most people don't even notice. I mean, I know I didn't notice for most of my life.
Anyway, the montage is our focus here, as it shows a children's choir singing a solemn prayer over images of the aftermath. Now, according to legend, this montage incorporates real images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the bombings. This is likely an urban legend, but the imagery was still inspired by the wreckage of those cities, thus equating Godzilla's attack to the bombings. It is this plea for salvation in the wake of devastation that finally moves Serizawa to act and do something very similar to what the Americans did at the end of the war, but I've said my piece on that elsewhere.
I'm sure you can see the commonality here. All of these moments are natural to the story, and they function as individual story beats.
Speaking from my own experience, I didn't have the context for any of this stuff when I first saw Gojira because I was a little omni-child who still had a lot to learn about world history. Even though I was lacking information, and even though I only had access to the American cut of Gojira at the time, my still developing mind understood these moments as part of the story being told. Years later, I would make it a point to learn the full meaning behind the film, but I did not need that meaning up front to know that I was watching something great.
Some people try justifying the forcing of politics into the fandom by claiming Gojira was political, therefore the entire series was political from the beginning, but this ignores the fact that politics is not what sustained this original movie throughout the decades. But I'll say more on that when the time is right. First, we need to bring Shin back into the picture. Like I said earlier, I'll concede that Shin, technically and with a couple caveats, meets those first two criteria I set in place. At least as far as my limited understanding of modern Japanese bureaucracy goes.
Our concern, however, is whether or not the film functions without the political context. In other words, does it function as a story?
Well, no. No, it doesn't. This movie falls short in just about every aspect of storytelling.
As I've already said, the characters are non-existent, the dialogue is all exposition and soapboxing, the plot happens just because it must happen, half of the music is lazily recycled from better movies, and Godzilla that an extension of what Shin established.
Perhaps most damning of all was how the most interesting aspect of the story, the tragedy of Goro Maki and his discovery of Godzilla, was deemed so unimportant that it was limited to just a few lines before being
The government ought to function, and excruciating analysis of what justifies a military attack. The most egregious detail, though, comes to us courtesy of Kayoko Patterson.
As I've stated before, Kayoko spends her opening scenes acting like a stereotypical American. Loud, boisterous, assertive, and not really that interested in anything that doesn't directly involve her.
She initially helps out Yakuchi's team just so she can add to her own political resume when she eventually runs for president in America. Then news comes of America's plan to nuke Godzilla, and all of a sudden she goes full Nipponophile and has a deep concern for her grandmother's homeland.
Mind you, that she has expressed no particular love for or interest in Japanese culture up to this point.
Kayoko is 100% prime beef American until she hears about the bomb, and the next thing we know, she's delivering an impassioned speech about how she doesn't want the land of her ancestors to suffer again as it did in the 40s. That particular speech culminates with the sudden appearance of two photographs depicting the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, respectively.
I should also point out that these images appear without context. Kayoko and Yakuchi are not in a museum, nor does one of them have these images on hand for whatever reason. The pictures just magically appear on screen as if they're part of a slideshow.
They do not exist for the characters, they exist for you, the audience. You are supposed to see these images, immediately have a negative reaction, and thus feel bad about what's going to happen.
The response you have is not because you feel bad for the characters, it's because you've been manipulated. On a related note, there's another glaring instance of this happening in Shin, also involving Kayoko.
There's a moment where Kayoko laments that doing as you please is difficult to do in Japan, and she says this with a level of frustration as though she were a native.
I would like to remind everyone once more that Kayoko Ann Patterson is American. Oh, she's got Japanese heritage, but she was raised in America. Given her middle and last names, she probably is also at least half Caucasian. So, where is this complaint coming from exactly?
We've seen no evidence that she spent any time learning about or trying to integrate into Japanese culture, yet here she is expressing a very Japanese sentiment. So I ask again, where does this come from?
I'll tell you where it comes from, Omni. It comes from the script.
Anno had this particular point he wanted to make as part of the movie's message, but there was no place to include it naturally, so he just put the words in Kayoko's mouth and figured nobody would care.
It doesn't matter if the context works as long as the message is delivered. And in helping to point that out, Snazzy, you've hit on the real problem.
Thanks to how character-driven Gojira is, and thanks to how each character has a specific role to play in the plot, the themes and messages can arise naturally when the time is right. Serizawa's personal turmoil about his unwanted invention and the prospect of using it is properly built up throughout the film, and the themes naturally stem from that turmoil. Moreover, this cannot be applied to any other character in the whole film. It is Serizawa's arc, custom made just for him. You cannot switch him and Yamane around and still have it work.
Shin, however, prioritizes its political messaging to such a degree that it exists despite the characters rather than because of them. Ironically, the claim that the human characters in Shin collectively represent the nation of Japan as a whole has been right the whole time, but it's not the defense people think it is. If anything, it's an admittance of guilt.
Pretty much all of the dialogue is an expression of political views, and those views are distributed evenly among the cast, regardless of whether or not it makes sense for them to say, or if we even remember their names. Why should it matter? They're only mouthpieces after all, able to be switched out for each other without affecting the plot in any way. Not individuals, but a collective whole, a hive mind. All are one. You will be assimilated. One of us, one of us. Those who do not serve the state must be eliminated.
The reason is because Shin never existed to tell a story. It exists purely to broadcast a political message. You know, I've avoided saying it in the past, but now I figure there's no sense beating around the bush anymore. Shin is a propaganda film, plain and simple.
The only purpose this movie serves is to tell you what you should think, and the point it makes is so on the nose that it barely counts as allegory. Nothing else matters. Sure, it's not the first Godzilla film to feature a socio-political message, but it is one of the few to highlight that message at the expense of everything else.
Now, I wish to make very clear that being a propaganda movie is not the same thing as being a movie with a message. When you get right down to it, any work of fiction can have a message to it. Heck, any piece of art can have a message to it without necessarily being propaganda. What makes it propaganda is when the message is the most important thing, and it's delivered with all the subtlety of a jackhammer in a minefield. Perhaps this is where my own personal bias comes in, I realize, but I really do not like propaganda. I don't even like propaganda that I would potentially agree with, and I'll prove it too.
Take Inherit the Wheeze, an episode from the later days of Pinky and the Brain. This episode was made in response to the then recent and shocking news that cigarette companies had found sneaky ways of advertising their products to children, from product placement in family-friendly movies to cartoon mascots like the infamous Joe Camel. It exists purely to skewer big tobacco for this wretched practice, as well as throw its hat in with other anti-smoking PSAs of the time. It's also my least favorite episode of the whole show.
Now, I hate cigarettes. I literally cannot be around them, and I don't think they're a healthy habit to take up, so I don't encourage people to do it. So theoretically, I agree with the sentiment of this episode, but that doesn't make the episode good.
It's way too on the nose, and it forgets to be funny while it hammers you over the head with its moral. Back in the 90s, it might have been a timely piece to make, but it prioritized its message over everything else. As such, it's aged as well as the smokers who appear in it. I bring it up here to show you that I'm opposing Shin because it does the same thing, not because I disagree with what it's saying or because I don't understand what it's saying.
In fact, contrary to what so many people have claimed in the past, I understand exactly why Shin did so well in Japan.
Shin drew in a larger audience than any previous Godzilla film because it was timely. It voiced out loud what so many people in the island nation were thinking and feeling in the wake of 3/11. Naturally, anyone who lived to witness the disaster or was directly affected by it would feel something when seeing a fictional work repeating their feelings back to them. I grew up in post-9/11 America, so I know how that works. Heck, I'll even concede that Shin was probably necessary for Japan's national psyche to recover. Timely material such as this is an important step in helping people move forward from tragedy.
There, I said it. Shin was an important and necessary film for the people of Japan circa 2016 Hideaki Anno Domine.
But Gojira was also timely, was it not?
It was indeed, Snazzy, but that brings me to my next point. Timeliness can only sustain a film for so long. And were timely when they debuted.
Gojira was made in response to the climate of 1954, while Shin was made in response to the climate of 2016. That's something the films have in common.
However, the crew behind Gojira were not interested in pure political rhetoric. They knew that in order for this film to work, they had to bring their A-game to every level.
As such, they devoted most of their focus to crafting things like the plot, the characters, the music, the special effects, and all of those other elements that make for a good film.
And that, my friends, is why Gojira has aged so incredibly well.
As stated, it was very timely upon its release, but the socio-political landscape that fueled its themes no longer exists today. The message doesn't directly apply to the modern world as anything more than a historical lesson. Instead, it's the timeless aspect, the story, that allowed it to survive the decades and still find an audience even among people with no context for the history that inspired it. That is the mark of a truly great film.
I don't see those timeless elements anywhere in Shin, and I believe that ultimately that will be its undoing.
Shin is very much grounded in the socio-political landscape of 2016 Japan, and that landscape is going to change. It's inevitable. Change is likely already occurring. The Japan of, say, 2076 will be a very different place with a very different culture, even if that culture is still ultimately Japanese.
Shin is so rooted in the year 2016 that it's well on its way to retroactively becoming a period piece. From where I stand, I don't see a bright future for it.
The best it can hope for is to become like Godzilla vs. Ghidorah, a message movie representing a bygone time which has aged very strangely. It'll be an artifact, maybe not worth totally dismissing, but definitely not worth dwelling on for too long. Oh sure, it'll still have its fans here and there, but few of them will say it surpasses Gojira, and the rest of the fandom will be focused on whatever new incarnation of the character has shown up since then.
You know, that actually brings up one last point I'd like to make before wrapping this entry up.
With each new reboot of the Godzilla series, I always find myself going back to the originals, good or bad.
While I've always considered Gojira to be a great film, I've gained newfound appreciation for it from both the Polygon trilogy, which I detest, and the Monsterverse, which I enjoy.
That also serves as proof that Gojira is truly timeless, because we can line it up to films made decades later and find that it not only holds up, but layers you never thought about before can be revealed in doing so.
There is subtext in Gojira to literally last through the decades. Shin, on the other hand, has no subtext.
What should be subtext, the politics, is instead the main text, literally in some shots, and that text applies to very specific events. Years from now, I guarantee fans won't be using Shin as the gold standard for measurement. They will be using Gojira as they always have. What more can I possibly say?
Well, there actually is one last thing to discuss, and it might be the most important thing of all. But we'll get to that in the next video. Until such time as we meet again, I actually made it through the whole thing without turning it in.
Thank you all for watching. If you want to see us keep doing what we're doing, you might consider doing all the usual YouTube things, as well as hopping down to the description to find links to DeviantArt, Patreon, Twitter, and links for the different books in the Tales from the Omnivault universe. Your support is naturally appreciated. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.